Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Pen is Mightier. This is episode 6, and we are continuing in Burnt Like Cold Iron, which is a Lord of the Rings fan fiction. Our next chapter, chapter 9, is going to be read by... This is episode 6, and we are continuing in Burnt Like Cold Iron, which is a Lord of the Rings fan fiction. Our next chapter, chapter 9, is going to be read by Brandon. So,
everybody.
Yeah, he's here, guys. Don't worry, he's still here.
All
right.
After all these episodes, right?
Yeah, we're gonna start. We're gonna start. Let's do it.
All right. So chapter 9, I walk a lonely road. I woke up to myself curled up in a ball in the grass, a cricket crawling leisurely across my face. With a scream, I was on my feet, scrabbling wildly at my face until my heartbeat calmed back down. I looked around blankly, trying uselessly to get my bearings after such a rude awakening. My throat was scratchy and my blood felt sluggish in my veins. Probably dehydrated, I thought, my heart sinking. When was the last time you had any water? I swallowed. But the back of my throat was dry as a desert, and I wound up coughing violently. Wincing, I pressed the grubby hand to my forehead, feeling a hot, stinging lump on my temple. Had I had a concussion yesterday? I wasn't sure, and I guess there was no way of knowing now. God, you're a mess, B, I muttered. I studied my surroundings with bleary eyes. It was morning, I realized. I must have spent the entire night out, cold on the muddy ground, and just behind me was the helicopter. Oh, I let out a shaky breath. Right. The helicopter was lying on its side where I had left it yesterday, its tail and propellers bent at violent angles. Huge gashes and divots had been gouged into the earth where the blades had struck as it fell. The whole thing looked so violent now, so utterly unreal. My gut twisted at the sight, and I turned away. The sun was emerging over the ridge of the mountains in the distance, and I stared around me for a long while, marveling at the endless expanse of grassland. It hadn't really sunk in when I was locked in that tiny cell in Isengard, that the whole world around me was no longer the same. Or maybe it had, but I just hadn't realized what it meant until now. Despite myself, part of me had felt like all I had to do was cross the mountains surrounding the tower, and I'd be back in Texas. Just past the ridge of the horizon, I'd seen the outline of downtown skyscrapers, interstates, and cars and telephone lines. I sat down, my heart heavy, and blinked back, the tears prickling behind my eyes. The world extended around me in every direction, enormous and wild. The wild blue sky, the unending hills. Suddenly I felt very small. Listlessly, I tore a handful of grass from the ground, letting the pieces drift away on the breeze. I watched them float away, my head in my hands. Now that I was free from Isengard, what was I going to do? I didn't know where I was or where the nearest civilization was, only that I was a long way from where I began. Safe from Saruman, at least. That was something. Food and water should be my first priority, I decided. I wondered if there was a water bottle in the helicopter that I'd missed among the camping supplies. Steeling myself, I approached the helicopter and hoisted myself clumsily back up to the pilot's door. The inside of the vehicle was in almost as bad shape as the outside. The supplies I'd stolen were scattered in every which way, covered in pieces of broken glass from the windshield and the pilot's window. I allowed myself to tumble inside, where I stood in a crouch on what used to be the passenger's side wall. Carefully, I began shifting through the supplies and tossed whatever still looked useful up and out the open pilot's door to land on the grass outside. Up went the box of emergency flares, the Kevlar vest, the box of ammunition, and the books I'd grabbed from Saruman's stores. Admittedly, the books didn't look particularly useful. One was a science textbook, one was a book of American poetry, and the third was a yellowed library copy of Gulliver's Travels. But I couldn't bring myself to leave them in the belly of the helicopter. Nathan's words came back to me again. I always carry a good book with me when I leave the house. It's like having an old friend with you everywhere you go. Tears threatened to spill from my eyes again. Nathan would be furious with me if he ever found out I lost his book. Or would he just be jealous that I was experiencing his favorite tale firsthand? Would he even believe me? I wondered. Would anyone? I knew instinctively that Caroline and John wouldn't. Kidnapped by a wizard, they think I was crazy. They'd give each other those looks. The ones that conveyed all the dismissive things I always feared they said about me when I wasn't there. The looks that hurt more than their harshest words. I sighed. My mom certainly wouldn't believe me either, and why should she? My mom was all business and logic. There was no room for magic there. As flawed as I thought of something else, that they definitely wouldn't believe me at work. What excuse could I possibly give my boss when I made it back? I'm sorry, sir, but I was in Middle Earth. I would have called, see, but the wizard who kidnapped me didn't have cell service in his tower. It was already Tuesday. I pressed my palms into my eyes, trying to control my breathing. This was the second day of work I was missing in a row. Instead of going to work Monday morning, I'd stolen a helicopter and flown across the wilderness of a land that wasn't supposed to exist. God, I was so tired. With a sharp shake of my head, with a sharp shake of my head, I tried to stop worrying about it. Nothing you can do now, at any rate. Focus on getting home first, then come up with a story to tell. I dug through the electronics I'd stolen and the camping gear strewn about the floor, unsure of what I might need. There was an entire tent folded into a compact cylinder under the passenger seat, but it was so heavy and bulky that I dismissed it outright. A thermal sleeping bag, however, I kept. After shaking the pieces of broken glass off it, I stuffed the flashlight, compass, and Swiss Army knife into its folds. There was a canteen, but it was empty. I shook it upside down over my mouth despondently, but there wasn't a drop of water inside. I also found what looked like a miniature water purifier, which would have been more exciting if there had actually been any water to use it on. Of the electronics I'd stolen, not much looked useful. I should have looked more carefully at what I was taking, I reflected, studying a set of fancy-looking walkie-talkies, still in their plastic packaging. With a shrug, I stuffed them into the sleeping bag, but left behind the rest. With the sleeping bag and my violin case slung across my shoulders, I made the awkward climb back out of the helicopter. I sighed, looking at my strange array of supplies, and put my hands on my hips. It was time to get moving. But first, I bit my lip. I didn't know where I was or how long it would take me to find civilization. The smartest thing to do would be to try to find help by any means necessary, wouldn't it? I winced, regarding the box of emergency flares for a long moment, then made up my mind. I was far enough from Saruman by now. He wouldn't find me here. I was easily 200 miles from Isengard. Even a wizard couldn't reach me that far away, right? I nodded uneasily, opening the box of flares. After skimming the instruction guide, complete with diagrams, thankfully, I removed the plastic black gun from the case and wedged one of the flares inside. For a moment, I clutched the loaded flare gun in my hands, closing my eyes in desperation. Let someone find me, please. Anyone but Saruman. I pointed the flare at the sky and pulled the trigger. A noise like a firework echoed around me, and I flinched as smoke and sparks exploded upward. A reddish ball of fire lingered in the air high above me, the dark smoke trail stark against the cloudy sky even in the bright daylight. Heart pounding as though I'd just run a marathon. I packed up the flares and gathered my supplies. It took a while, but I managed to arrange the sleeping bag on my back with its long shoulder strap, and I slung my violin case over that, feeling rather like a turtle with a too large shell. The rest of my supplies I gathered up in my arms. With a last uneasy look back at the helicopter and the reddish line of smoke fading into the sky above me, I began to walk. My process was slow. With every step, my sandals snagged in the tall grass, and my supplies grew heavier on my back. Was I even walking in the right direction? Doubts nagged at me, but I continued onward. I hadn't seen any signs of civilization as I flew yesterday, which meant that my best hope was ahead of me, following the mountain range far to my right. I'd hoped to find something edible before long, berries or fruit trees or even patches of clover in the grass, but there was nothing. The grass was dry and prickly and uniform, and there were no trees as far as the eye could see. The only other plants were the occasional withered windblown bushes. Even if they'd had berries or nuts among their dark leaves, I wouldn't have trusted them not to poison me. It had been well over a day since my last meal, and I could practically feel myself wasting away. I was so hungry, I contemplated eating a handful of the dry grass below my feet, but the thought made my throat ache with thirst. Swallowing was getting more and more difficult, and I knew I would need to find some water soon. The worst part was when, late in the afternoon, I had to stop and pee. Admittedly, it felt marginally less awkward than peeing in a bucket, but I was rather alarmed by how little liquid seemed to be left in my body at all. I should have known better than to think I could survive off the land like this. I didn't know what I was doing, and there was nothing out here, nothing at all. The land was monotonous, quiet, and utterly still. No trees, no birds, no wind. The entire landscape felt haunted somehow, as though it were mourning something. I shook my head sharply. What a strange thing to think. I'd obviously been alone with my thoughts too long. In the overwhelming silence, I hummed the melodies of songs as I walked, mostly snippets of pieces I had been learning on the violin. I tapped the beats with my fingers on the box of emergency flares I'd wedged under my arm, and wished with all my heart that I was back at home with my violin. My supplies were getting heavier. I had to stop more and more frequently to adjust the bulky packages in my arms and sleeping bag on my back. The sun was just starting to sink over the horizon when I collapsed onto the grass, exhausted. I'd probably only made it a few miles in the whole day, but I didn't think I could walk another step. My feet were covered in blisters where my sandals had bitten into my skin, and my muscles ached. After a moment of deliberation, I set off another emergency flare. This one shone even more visibly in the darkening sky, and I jumped at the way the gunshot sound echoed over the empty hills. A chilly wind hissed through the grass, and I got the strangest feeling that this place knew I didn't belong there, that I wasn't welcome. How dare you come to this quiet, ghostly place, it seemed to say, and disturb the air with explosions and chemicals and smoke. I've definitely been walking too long, I said out loud. I shook off my uneasiness and set up camp. Really, my camp was just my sleeping bag laid out next to a pile of my supplies, but it would do for the night. I sat cross-legged on my sleeping bag, staring out at the darkening sky and clutching the flashlight to my chest. I felt distinctly uncomfortable. I'd never slept outdoors before. I didn't count the previous night, as I'd been out cold before night fell. I'd never even been camping. When my family traveled, we'd stay in hotels, and when we'd gone out into the wilderness, it was usually part of a guided tour or something. I'd grown up to love the outdoors and the wilderness, but I'd never experienced it like this. Not since I was a little girl lost on a family trip. Running after chipmunks and making imaginary friends with trees. Nervously, I burrowed deeper, into my sleeping bag, humming to myself again to combat the oppressive silence weighing down on me. I lay stiffly on my back, clutching my violin case to my chest, and using the folded Kevlar vest as a pillow. I watched as heavy clouds rolled in over the mountains to blot out the stars. Before long, the entire sky was enveloped in an unending, sickly gray, and I was encased in utter darkness. I pulled the thermal covers closer around my chin, and it was surprisingly chilly for a summer night, and the weight was comforting. It made me feel less exposed to the raw night sky. Something rustled in the grass near my head, and I jolted upright, biting back a scream. In an instant, my flashlight was on and waving back and forth through the grass. It was a mouse. I huffed sharply under my breath, watching it burrow through the grass a few feet from my sleeping bag. I'd never been afraid of the dark before, but this, I waved my flashlight across the hills cautiously. I never experienced darkness like this. I stayed upright, flashlight trained on the horizon until I calmed back down. Stiffly, I retreated back under my covers and turned off the flashlight. The darkness was so palpable now that I could practically feel it physically pressing against me. I couldn't get uncomfortable. Every time I closed my eyes, I flinched involuntarily, seeing flashes of movement flying at my face. Fireballs and shards of glass and the swing blur of a wizard's staff shaking I curled tighter under my violin case and squeezed my eyes shut. Saruman was far away. He couldn't hurt me here. Besides, my traitorous brain supplied, there are plenty of other things that could hurt you here. I wondered suddenly if there were any wild animals out here, mountain lions or wolves or some horrible dark creatures unique to Middle Earth. Because if wizards were real and magic was real, then that meant goblins were real too, didn't it? I flinched more violently than ever, and I reached a hand into my violin case to grasp the handle of the pistol I'd stored inside. It did little to comfort me. I squeezed my eyes shut. I hated this. I hated Middle Earth. I missed home so badly that it had become a physical ache in my chest, and I began to sob bitterly into my violin case. I cried and cried until my whole body was shaking uncontrollably, and my breath was coming in. Huh?
More crying. Stop
crying. And my breath was coming in, shuddering, hiccups, and gasps. Hopeless and miserable, I eventually drifted off into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of food and water and home. Suddenly, something was moving toward me. I felt the slightest of vibrations under my makeshift pillow, like footsteps, and heard the faintest of jostling sounds. Go away, I mumbled thickly, my tongue feeling heavy and dry in my mouth. The jostling grew louder. Suddenly, a terrible smell fled to my senses, and I felt a hot, snuffing breath on my face. My eyes flew open, inches away from a horse's snout. I screamed. The horse shied back, filling the air with the stamping of hooves and jangling of reins. Get back! I screamed blindly, still half asleep. I leapt to my feet, nearly falling over as my legs tangled in the sleeping bag. Stay away from me! My heart thundered painfully in my chest, and I rubbed at my eyes wearily, trying to get my bearings. Ah, good. You were sleeping so soundly I feared you were dead. A stranger was observing me tranquilly from the horse's saddle, patting his horse's neck as the animal calmed down. I stared wild-eyed. I don't think that's the expression, but anyway. Back at him. Oh, I thought it was wide-eyed.
No, wild-eyed is also an expression. Anything dash-eyed is probably an expression.
Interesting.
This
okay. Wild-eyed back at him, clutching my violin case to my chest protectively. Obscured as he was by a long tattered cloak and hat, the rider could have been anyone at all. Could Saruman have really found me so quickly? Was this one of his servants, a man like Einar, who would take me back to Isengard? I wasn't going to go back there. I wasn't. I said get back! I screamed as the man dismounted his horse. Don't come any closer. Fighting down a cold wave of panic, I dug in my violin case for the stolen pistol and pointed it at him. I couldn't shoot at him, I knew. But maybe I could intimidate him enough to keep him away. Instead, the stranger ignored the gun entirely, patting his horse's neck soothingly and leaning to whisper into its twitching ear. After a moment, he ventured forward, blinking owlishly at me, and bent to observe the sleeping bag lying in a heap between us. He touched the thermal fabric experimentally, making a sound of mild disapproval as he straightened up. What sort of material is this? He asked curiously, looking from me to the sleeping bag. It has a strange texture. I stared at him. The pistol was still in my shaking hand, pointing at the man's heart. Suddenly, feeling rather stupid, I let my arm fall back to my side. I don't know, I stammered. Polyester or something? I watched the stranger carefully, confused by his vacant, mumbling voice and odd mannerisms. Whoever he was, he didn't seem much like a threat anymore. The man was now holding up a Kevlar vest curiously, lifting his floppy hat to squint at it in the morning light. He was old, I realized with surprise. Old and entirely unarmed. What in the world was he doing out here? His thin frame was swallowed up by a truly hideous brown cloak, so ragged and patched that it looked like the remains of a dozen different cloaks sewn together. He didn't look like a murderer or a servant of Saruman or anything, more like an eccentric homeless man. I let out a slow breath and stowed the pistol back in my violin case. What is this? The man's crooked nose scrunched in confusion at the bulletproof vest. It is heavy, not armor, surely. Yeah, I muttered in reply, my voice painfully hoarse. Yeah, it's kind of like armor, I guess. I suppose it might stop an arrow if put to the test, the man muttered. You come from far away, with possessions such as these, he added, folding the vest carefully before setting it down. And you have been through quite an ordeal. Yes, quite an ordeal. I stepped back warily as the man studied me, but he didn't seem bothered by my unease. He stepped forward, observing me like I was a specimen under a microscope. I winced and stumbled back as he approached me, his rather bulgy brown eyes widening. Tree friend, he muttered incredulously, stroking his beard. I shrunk back as he loomed over me. Strange. Do you mind? I said, rather shrilly, scrambling to put more distance between myself and this crazy man. He finally seemed to realize he was making me nervous. One moment. Mumbling under his breath, the man turned back to his horse, his ragged brown cloak catching in the tall grass as he went. He grabbed a few things from his saddlebags and walked back toward me, his movements cautious and slow. Wordlessly, he set the items in the grass near my sleeping bag and backed away carefully again. Then he smiled at me from his floppy hat, gesturing at me to move forward. I was reminded distinctly of an animal trainer at the Dallas Zoo. Fine, I'll play along. With a sigh, I walked over to the sleeping bag and looked at the items he'd set down for me. Oh, the man had set down a small burlap sack and a strange sort of leather flask. I gasped. Water? Suddenly I was so thirsty I couldn't even think. I fell upon the flask, drinking and drinking until I was out of breath, my stomach aching and strength returning at last to my sluggish limbs. The water was musty and tasted strongly of leather, but I didn't care. I felt life flowing back into my veins, and I let out a delirious laugh as I sank down on the rumpled sleeping bag. When the flask was empty, I turned to the burlap sack the stranger had set down. It was full of some kind of flatbread, each piece wrapped in what looked like thin, pliant sheets of tree bark. I ate one tentatively, then another, marveling at the slight taste of grass and honeysuckle. In my half-starved state, they were easily the most delicious things I'd ever eaten, and I continued eating until I could barely move. Finally, I looked back up at the man, who was absently watching a rabbit hop through the grass a few yards off. Who are you? I burst out, coughing at the strange sensation of being hydrated and full. The man blinked as though he'd forgotten I was there. Oh, I'm Radagast. I'm Beatrice, I said, walking up and sticking out my hand. The man stared down at it with the same confused expression he'd shown the Kevlar vest. I flushed and dropped my hand back to my side. Anyway, thank you for the food and the water. I cleared my throat. Really, thank you. Radagast shifted from foot to foot uncomfortably, waving my words away with an impatient hand. I got the sense that he'd been without human interaction for much longer than I had. It was no trouble, he muttered. Yes, it was, I exclaimed, annoyed that he was so dismissive of having saved my life. I could have starved to death out here, and are you going to be able to find more water? I drank all yours. Guilt swept over me, and I buried my face in my hand. God, I'm so sorry. And there's hardly any bread left in your bag there either. I handed the remainder of his supplies back to him uncomfortably. I'm sorry I shouldn't have had so much. I know the land will. I will be able to find more water and food on my journey home, he mumbled, patting his horse's mane as he spoke. Like Einar, he seemed uneasy looking me in the eye. Oh, well, good. I ran a hand down my face, relieved. Where is your home, then? He gestured airily into the distance, still not looking at me. Across the misty mountains, near the forest of Mirkwood. Can you take me with you? The words were out of my mouth before I'd even considered them. Radagast turned to me at last. His eyebrows disappearing under the brim of his floppy hat. Why would I want you to accompany me, girl? My home is several weeks away by horseback. Not an easy journey. Oh, Well, I tugged at my tangled hair uncertainly. It's just, I mean, I don't know where I am. I don't have anywhere to go, and I need to find my way home somehow. I took a deep, shuddering breath and trying to control the desperation in my voice. Please, I can't just keep wandering around out here. You saw how I was doing on my own. I'd have started to death if you, what? Starved to death
Sorry,
if
loud noise.
yeah.
Turning my mic back on. Yeah, that's a typo, right? Starved
Yeah.
to death.
Starved to death. If you hadn't, Well, you cannot stay out here alone, the man interrupted, as though the idea had just occurred to him. You must get somewhere safe. That was what I put my head in my hand and sighed. Yeah, yes, I agree. So, can't I come with you? My home is likely not safe at all. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Radagast shook his head, the brim of his hat flopping back and forth. There are few safe places this far into the wild. No homely houses here, but one. I blinked as I registered what he said. There is one? I stammered eagerly. Where is it? Several days' ride to the north. Several days' ride? I repeated. Maybe I can make it if he helped me collect more food first. But on foot? That would at least be a week, maybe two. Yes, it is not far out of my way, the man continued slowly. He scratched at his beard for a moment, then seemed to make up his mind. Yes, very well. I will take you there. You will? I exclaimed. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Oh my god. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to me, Rasputin. Radagast. Right, sorry. I bounced on the balls of my feet, suddenly too giddy to focus. Well, oh my gosh, thank you. Wow, just let me get my things done, I laughed breathlessly, stunned by my good fortune. I was saved. I was going to find somewhere safe, and I was going to find my way home. I gathered up my scattered supplies from the grass and rolled up my sleeping bag as Radagast stared up vacantly into the sky. I paused in my packing to follow his eyes, where a flock of birds was flying past. Darting to and from, their black wings and screaming voices cut through the air sharply and made my skin prickle. Radagast, I said hesitantly, is everything alright? He jumped when I addressed him. Yes, it probably is nothing. But the man sent me a sharp look from under his wild eyebrows. I wonder if sending your fireworks into the sky was a good idea, he added after a moment, watching the flock of birds circle overhead and disappear into the distance to the south. You saw my emergency flares? I asked, smiling rather proudly. Then they worked, after all. Yes, the man said slowly, a spacey look back in his eyes. He shook himself after a moment, as though he'd forgotten where he was. Let us move on. The sooner the better. Still looking rather flustered, he helped me arrange some of my things into the saddlebags. Thank you, I repeated earnestly, still overwhelmed by his kindness. Look, I'll pay you back for helping me. I don't know how. I'll find a job somehow when we get to... Where are we going exactly? Rivendell, Radagast said. The last homely house. Rivendell, I said slowly. The name was familiar. I closed my eyes as I tried to think. It was in the movie, wasn't it? It was from The Hobbit! There are elves in Rivendell, aren't there? I asked. It's like a valley, isn't it? With trees and waterfalls and music? Yes, you summarized it well, Radagast said distractedly, adjusting the horse's saddle. For such an ancient, rail-thin man, he leapt onto the horse's back with surprising grace. I slung my sleeping bag and violin case onto my shoulders, and after some stumbling and cursing, managed to clamber onto the horse behind him. What?
You cut off a bit there, but yeah, after some awkward stumbling and cursing.
Okay. After some awkward stumbling and cursing, managed to clamber onto the horse behind him. Hold on to my shoulders, Radagast said. Poppy doesn't seem to like you much. I winced as his horse tossed his head violently, as though agreeing with him. Awkwardly, I reached up and held onto the fraying cloak, and with a jostle of the reins, we were off. Endnote. Let me know what you think of Radagast so far. I hated the Hobbit movies version of him. I always pictured him as being weird and out of touch, but not nearly as bad as what the movies came up with. He just seemed like a quiet, awkward, well-meaning guy who hasn't spent time with actual humans in a really long time. I tried to let him keep his dignity, and hopefully I've succeeded. Don't forget to review. I really appreciate y'all's feedback, advice, and questions. Thanks for reading. And that was chapter 9.
Okay, cool. Present your thoughts.
Long.
Yeah, that one was a long
that
one.
Yeah, and I think this upcoming one is pretty long too. So have fun. No, so honestly, I think that this book's getting I'm getting more engaged as I read along. I know you mentioned, and I'll let you talk about this more, but I feel like, this is all part of her character arc, wherever it's going, Bee's character arc. And I think that, right now it was like, I feel like a lot has happened, but I feel like a lot hasn't happened. Like, I feel like a lot happened in like the first couple chapters, and these past few chapters that we've read have been more so kind of just showing us her going through the motions of like escaping and then trying to make her way, but then falling short, kind of like a classic underdog. Like, she just gives big underdog energy. Like, I think that at some point she's going to rise up again and be able to maybe fight Saruman or whoever like the villains are. So I don't know, that's just like the vibe I'm getting. But I'm interested in your thoughts here as well.
Yeah, so first off, I will say I do like her depiction of Radagast better than the movies, now that she's mentioned it. Because like, he was a crazy person in the movies. Like, he was straight up just like a wacko.
Got it.
But this one is kind of more like he's distracted, like very distracted, and kind of like out of touch. But he's still like a person. He's still like a noble wizard. I know you don't know this. But
I don't. So I really
didn't. So in the Lord of the Rings, there's 3 wizards. There is the gray, the white, and the brown. So Saruman is the white. Gandalf the gray. You've heard that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Radagast the brown. So Radagast is the 3rd wizard, and he's like the nature wizard.
Got it.
So I think I really like her way of kind of reshaping like a character that a lot of people have just overlooked or set up a pretty standard archetype for. I like that. I think that's like a very noble thing to accomplish with a fan fiction, because like a lot of fan fiction just goes off tropes, but it's nice to see that someone's actually trying to modify something and trying to portray someone in a new light through their work. So that's nice. I think maybe her overall method of you said that a lot of things happened but also didn't happen so far, but I think what the author's trying to do is trying to like show us how B is growing like into this new surrounding and like this new setting. Excuse me. And I think like her whole transformation, right? Her whole character arc where she becomes like this badass kick-ass hero, right? I think maybe she could have done it better. Again, I referenced the author using she, even though I shouldn't. So the author is, they could have done better. I would say I would have liked to see her fire the gun, like just out of instinct or like just out of like a sudden impulse. And then Radagast being kind of scared, but also like, oh, what's this? And then B being like, oh, I didn't mean to, I didn't mean to fire the gun. I'm so sorry. But then he isn't scared. He's just kind of like wondrous about it. I think that would have done a lot for both of their characters and shown like both Radagast's honest curiosity and his out of touchness, and also B's like, her instinct is backing her up now, instead of her like, oh, I'm far from home, I'm so scared, I'm gonna sob into my violin case, kind of deal.
One thing I did want to ask was, how did Radagast know what a firework is? Because I figured that a firework is more of a modern technology, but maybe I'm wrong. But I just don't.
I don't think he was listening. Oh wait, no, he said, I wonder if sending your fireworks into the sky. Yeah, so they have fireworks because Gandalf the Grey is a very famous fireworks peddler. So Radagast would know about fireworks, yeah. Also, fireworks are not a modern invention.
Well, no, I'm not saying that they're a modern invention, but I feel like, I don't know if those type of societies wouldn't use one or even know what it is or what it does. So
Well, I mean, it's supposed to be like set in the medieval era, right?
yeah, did they
Like
have
a
fireworks? I'm
fantasy
really not
yeah,
sure.
fireworks were appreciated or like constructed by the Chinese people in like 2000 BC or something like that.
Gotcha. Well, okay, I don't know if it was in this kind of, you know, time period. Not time period, but like
No,
universe basically.
they were
So,
primitive fireworks, but
okay.
you know, the fireworks in the Lord of the Rings franchise are all very magical. Like
Got it.
they're operated by wizards who put magic into it.
Got it.
Anyway, we're taking too long discussing chapter 9. I will move on to chapter 10, which is called Howdy. All right, chapter 10. So, I said awkwardly, shifting uncomfortably in the saddle. You said your home was near Milkwood? Radagast jumped slightly, as though I'd forgotten I was sitting behind him. Mirkwood, he corrected, without turning to look back at me. Right. I adjusted my grip on his cloak, tapping my fingers idly on the rough fabric. So, what's it like there? My traveling companion contemplated this for a while. He didn't seem to be in any hurry to have a proper conversation, and it was beginning to grate on my nerves. I had to stop myself from tugging on his cloak like an impatient toddler. Mirkwood, he said after a minute or two, is not what it once was. In what way? I pressed. Radagast shrugged. I waited for him to respond, but he just gave a non-committal grunt and fell silent. I stifled a groan. Ah, he exclaimed after a moment. I looked up eagerly, wondering if he was finally going to talk to me. Instead, he reached out a hand and whistled lightly. What? I began, but Radagast shushed me and whistled again. I stared at him in confusion for a moment, then bit back a gasp as a bird landed on the man's outstretched finger. Hello, my friend, he said softly, keeping his hand extremely still, despite the jostling of Poppy's hooves. Radagast leaned forward and whispered something to the bird. It was just an ordinary sparrow, at least I thought it was, but it was bobbing its head up and down as though it was actually listening to Radagast's words. What are you do? Shh! He breathed, leaning closer as the bird chirped something back to him. Ah, is that so? Radagast murmured. These are dark tidings indeed. The bird bobbed its head and whistled. Are you really talking to it? I said loudly, and with a startled flutter of wings the bird was gone. Radagast turned and glared at me. I winced. I was attempting to, yes, he said, his tone not quite so mild as before. What are you, Snow White? I exclaimed. You can't just talk to animals, can you? Radagast flicked the reins idly, facing forward again. That is untrue. Anyone can talk to animals, he said sagely. I rolled my eyes so hard I was surprised they didn't pop out of my head. Okay, fine. Anyone can talk to them, I said exasperatedly. But how did it talk back? And how did you know what it was saying? How did it understand you? And the way it just landed on your finger like that? I gestured wildly into the air, lost for words. Can everyone do that here? I mean, is it that normal in Middle-earth? I do not believe so, he said, then scratched his beard thoughtfully. You do not hail from Middle-earth. Well, no, I said hesitantly. I thought not. Radagast sounded entirely unconcerned. He could have been talking about the weather. I braced myself for the inevitable interrogation, but he simply shrugged, flicked the reins, and continued on. Not much time had passed before another sparrow flitted over and landed on Poppy's mane. The horse flicked her ears in annoyance, but allowed the bird to perch there as Radagast whispered to it. Next came a cardinal, its red feathers standing out starkly as it rested on the man's brown-cloaked shoulder, chirping into his ear. What are they saying? I exclaimed at last, unable to take it anymore. Radagast looked up as the dragonfly he'd been mumbling to flitted away. They are answering my questions, he said after a while. And what are you asking them, then? I demanded. Radagast shrugged airily, his hat flopping over his eyes. Questions. I covered my face in my hands to stop myself from screaming. We stopped only a few times throughout the day. Radagast had been right when he said he'd know how to find food and water in the wilderness. He dismounted here and there, seemingly at random, to pluck handfuls of berries from bushes or dig up small white roots from unassuming tufts of weeds. He even found drinking water from hidden ponds and springs tucked away in the hilltops, which were gradually growing greener, with the occasional withered tree twisting out of the grass and rock. I followed Radagast's lead as he awkwardly pointed out which plants were safe to eat from and how to find the ripest berries to eat. It was actually kind of pleasant having someone to talk to and learn from as I traveled.
At the very least, it was better than my lonely, miserable wandering the day before. As we gathered a rather meager dinner, I paused in our foraging, my arms full of dandelions and a lumpy root Radagast had called burdock, to find the man crouched low in the grass, talking to a field mouse, which had reared up on its tiny hind legs and was squeaking intently at him. Radagast nodded sagely, whispering urgently back and shooting a glance in my direction. I scowled, feeling oddly left out. I wonder if they were talking about me. I fretted for a moment, biting my lips self-consciously before coming to my senses. It's a mouse, for Pete's sake. Get it together. Radagast patted the creature on the head fondly before straightening up as though nothing odd had happened. There was nothing to do but roll my eyes and keep gathering food. I knew that if he was willing to tell me what these animals were saying to him, he'd tell me in his own time. The sun was setting over the western plains when we came upon a rare grove of trees in a valley between two steep hills. We shall rest here for the night, Radagast told me as Poppy came to a halt. By now I had noticed that his horse seemed to respond to Radagast's vaguest of intentions rather than commands made with reins and stirrups. I dismounted clumsily, half falling off Poppy's back as my sore muscles screamed in protest. Dragging myself to my feet, I looked around at the stunted, wind-blown trees. Should we make a fire? I asked hopefully, dropping the contents of my sleeping bag and violin case onto a pile onto the grass. Oh no, Radagast exclaimed, wringing his hands and looking around. That's not a good idea. My spirits sank. A cold wind was already biting through my flimsy, tattered blouse, and I knew it would only get colder as night fell. Come on, I'm freezing, I whined, but Radagast waved a hand dismissively. Come now, it's a warm summer evening. Besides, he said, patting Poppy's neck reassuringly as he removed her saddle, I wish for us to remain unseen this night. I scowled. Why are you worried anyway? We're in the middle of nowhere. Who would see us? Radagast removed Poppy's harness and saddlebag slowly, taking his time. Poppy wandered off as the man began unpacking his bags, and I twitched impatiently as he fussily arranged his belongings in neat little rows in the grass. Without looking up, he shrugged and spoke at last. The White Wizard would see us, of course. He's looking for you. What? The White Wizard has many eyes throughout these lands. He glanced from side to side into the dark undergrowth, and I shivered, suddenly wondering if we were being watched. How do you know he's looking for me? I said, my voice an octave higher than normal. I glared at him. Don't tell me the sparrows and rabbits told you that. Radagast shrugged again, and I groaned, pressing my face into my hands. I shouldn't have set off those emergency flares. I've ruined everything, haven't I? I cannot say, Radagast said calmly, now spreading out his bedroll in the grass. He smoothed the ragged blanket out painstakingly, seemingly unaware of my panic. I am almost certain that your fireworks yesterday alerted the White Wizard as they alerted me, he added after a while. Nothing else in Middle-earth could resemble those remarkable flares. Even Gandalf's fireworks are nothing like them. Wait, you know Gandalf? I said, my voice still shaky. Yes. A ridiculous thought flitted through my mind. I narrowed my eyes at him. And you know Saruman too, I ventured. Of course, Radagast said. He was one of my order. Your order? I repeated, my suspicions growing stronger. What order? He didn't answer. His buggy eyes were scanning the trees airily, as though he'd nearly forgotten I was there again. I frowned. Are you a wizard? I said hesitantly. He jumped slightly, turning to blink at me with owlish eyes. Yes, of course. I'm Radagast the Brown. A cold, horrified feeling was seeping through my limbs. Oh, I couldn't believe I'd been right. I took a step back. And are you more like Gandalf or Saruman? Radagast the Brown didn't answer. Instead, he was staring distractedly into the darkness again, his expression rather vacant. I followed his gaze, which was focused on a firefly hovering over the grass. The insect let out a yellow flicker of light, bright in the dim evening air. With a delicate motion, the wizard plucked the firefly out of the grass with a thin, weathered hand and smiled gently, whispering to it under his breath. I watched him for a long moment, studying the tender expression on his face, and fought a sudden urge to laugh. You're nothing like Saruman, are you? Sighing heavily, I unrolled my sleeping bag and sat down next to the wizard. I felt ridiculous for even thinking it. As strange as he was, Radagast the Brown had to be the least threatening person I'd ever encountered. I had hoped you would tell me of your dealings with Saruman unprompted, the wizard said after a while. The firefly on his palm flickered again and flitted away into the darkness. The white wizard does not often show interest in mortal men, or indeed anyone of late. Tell me, what was his interest in you? Suddenly nervous, I hugged my knees to my chest. It was cold out, whatever Radagast said. You already guessed I wasn't from Middle-earth, I said. That's because Saruman brought me here, from a city called Dallas, in another world. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain. Radagast nodded. Go on, he encouraged, still looking intently into the night sky. I took a deep breath to reassure myself and continued. Telling my story grew easier with each word. It was cathartic somehow to confide in someone else, and Radagast's placid smiles and vacant nods of encouragement were very calming. Did you already know what Saruman was doing? I asked. The wizard hadn't seemed particularly surprised by my story. No, not exactly, the wizard admitted after a while, looking decades older than before, his face thin and ragged in the near total darkness. I was in Isengard not 3 months ago at Saruman's bidding. I saw what was collected in the White Wizard's storerooms. I saw the fervor in his eyes. I smelled the metal, the smoke, the fires burning in the pits below Isengard. Yet I had believed, I'd hoped, but it is useless now. The 9 have ridden from Minas Morgul. The head of my order has betrayed us, and now we must contend with your weapons on top of everything else. I'm sorry, my voice was small, and I hugged my knees to my chest. They're not my weapons, I wanted to protest, but I still felt responsible. If I hadn't told Saruman anything, if I had hidden the book better or destroyed it, if I had stayed in Isengard and perhaps tried to destroy his collection of weaponry. But Radagast was right. It was useless now. We sat in silence for a long time. The sky grew inky black, and I kept thinking that I could see the glint of black eyes, or that I could hear the heavy thud of footsteps, followed by the swish of a long cloak. I twitched helplessly on my sleeping bag, wanting to get out my flashlight, but afraid of attracting attention, as Radagast had warned. He was staring unblinkingly into the shadows of the trees. Saruman's betrayal must not have been easy for him to take. You must inform the Lord Elrond of Saruman's treachery, Radagast said at last, as well as Gandalf's imprisonment. I nodded, eager to do something that might help. Do you think he'd be able to do anything? Would Lord Elrond be able to help Gandalf? Or is there anything you can do for him? Lord Elrond, he corrected placidly, and I do not know. Perhaps. I waited for the wizard to continue, but he didn't. I sighed, curling up in my sleeping bag and looking up at the night sky. There were so many stars here. The light pollution of Dallas was worlds away. I'd learned the constellations as a little kid in my outdoorsy hiking phase, but looking up at the sky now, I didn't recognize any. The black sky spread endlessly above us, and I wondered how it could be so oppressively dark, even with so many stars shining. Tears welled up in my eyes again, and I pressed my fists into my eyes in exasperation, not wanting Radagast to see me cry. Oh my... Please! Stop! There's no reason to. Why are you crying? It's such a waste of sentences, man. I glanced over at the wizard surreptitiously. His shadowy profile hadn't moved an inch. He may as well have been turned to stone. I wondered if he'd fallen asleep sitting up, or if wizards even needed to sleep. Maybe he was just staring intently into the horizon like I had been, staring as though trying to pierce through the trees and hills to see something far out of reach. I sighed and rolled over, curling my knees up to my chest. The smell of grass and wet earth filled my nose, and the heavy, plasticky fabric of my Kevlar vest pillow dug into my face. It took a long time for me to fall asleep. I was woken up by Poppy's snuffling breath on my face again. I sat up and rubbed at my face quickly to hide the wetness on my cheeks. Morning, Radagast, I muttered. Morning, Poppy. Radagast didn't answer, preoccupied as he was with talking to a mouse that was running up and down his tattered sleeve. I rubbed at my face again to wake myself up, and tried to comb some of the tangles out of my greasy hair with my fingers, more self-conscious of how gross I was now that I was traveling with someone. The wizard wouldn't notice or care, of course, but I was still uncomfortable. We had a meager breakfast of leftover berries and roots. My stomach rumbled painfully, and I tried to ignore it. This was better than nothing, after all. Let us move on, Radagast said briskly. Time is of the essence. Lord Elrond should be informed of your news at the nearest opportunity. I nodded wearily, packing up my things and clambering up onto Poppy's back. The day passed in a dull, if companionable silence. Poppy carried us at a faster pace than before, though we still covered an infuriatingly short distance by nightfall. I was restless. I never traveled this slowly in my life, accustomed as I was to driving 80 miles an hour on the interstate. The next day was much the same. Radagast and I didn't talk all that often, but he seemed to grow more comfortable answering my questions when I asked them, and no longer jumped in the saddle or got flustered when I addressed him. We had settled into a kind of awkward routine. If Radagast vastly preferred to travel alone, at least he didn't show it often, and if I still cried myself to sleep at night, I managed to hide it well enough from him. On the fourth morning after setting out with Radagast, the wizard turned in the saddle and offered me a rare smile, his eyes crinkling merrily under the floppy brim of his hat. "The last homely house is just beyond those hills," he said, pointing over Poppy's head in the distance. "We will reach Rivendell by midday." "Really?" I gasped. I craned my neck to try and see over the wizard's bony shoulders, but I didn't see anything. The land had grown greener and rockier as we traveled, with wide patches of leafy trees, small cliffs, and steep valleys cutting abruptly into the hills. Still, I didn't see any signs of elves or homely houses. "In fact," Radagast added after a moment, "one of Lord Elrond's patrols rides out to meet us even now." I couldn't see anyone approaching, but I nodded, trusting my traveling companion's intuition. We continued riding in silence though I kept shifting excitedly in the saddle, unable to sit still. The morning slipped by, maddeningly slowly. Then, "Radagast the Brown!" cried a sudden voice. Gah! I jumped forward so violently that my forehead collided with the wizard's bony shoulder blades. A horse and rider were approaching us, moving so quietly and swiftly that the stranger was level with us in seconds, his gray horse falling into step alongside Poppy before I even knew what was happening. "Back so soon, my friend. I didn't know you had missed us so much," the rider laughed, making me jump again. His voice was clear, deep, and musical, and I used the wrong voice for his voice, but that's okay. His laugh washing over me like a bucket of ice water. I stared at him, slack-jawed, as our horses trotted along in tandem. An elf! Oh my gosh, he's an elf! Long sunlight-colored hair flowed like water down his back, his face framed by slender, pointy ears. I couldn't believe how inhuman he was. The actors from the Lord of the Rings movies seemed ridiculous in comparison. He was regal and fey and entirely unearthly. And those eyes. Radagast pinched the bridge of his long nose. "Hello again, Lanyon." Poppy came to a halt, as did the elf's horse. I heard the wizard sigh heavily. "When you last passed through these hills, you scarcely had time to say hello," the elf exclaimed, raising his eyebrows in mock offense. "And now you've returned to us not 2 weeks later." "Well, yes, a rather unexpected situation has called me back to Rivendell," the wizard replied, gesturing mildly to me. Lanyon turned to look at me, and I froze under his gaze. "Oh, howdy," I croaked, giving the elf a stupid little wave. Did I really just say howdy? Oh my god, B, what is your problem? "Hello, miss." Lanyon extended his hand to me, looking curious. "Hi," I said stupidly, and I felt myself flush as I realized I'd greeted him twice. Forcing my eyes back into my head, I grabbed his proffered hand and shook it heartily. The elf, who I realized too late had been moving to kiss the back of my hand, not shake it, looked quite taken aback. "Oh, sorry, I'm B," I muttered, clearing my throat. "Smith. Beatrice Smith, I mean." I wished quite desperately that the earth would open up and swallow me whole. "So you're the unexpected situation that brings dear old Radagast the Brown back to us," Lanyon said, looking rather confused by my behavior, but mercifully ignoring my embarrassment. "Where did the wizard find you?" he asked. "Radagast has been known to have odd traveling companions, but they most often have 4 legs and a tail." He flashed the wizard a mocking, dazzling grin, and I felt rather faint. I cleared my throat again, finding it impossible to look the elf in the eyes. "I need to speak to Lord Elrond," I managed. "It's really important." Lanyon glanced quizzically at Radagast, who nodded in confirmation of my words. "Very well then. I'm certain you have quite the story to tell." As Radagast and I dismounted Poppy, thankfully I managed to do it without falling into the grass. The wizard and elf continued to talk, this time slipping into another language. Elvish, I recognized. My excitement outweighing my embarrassment as I tried to listen in. The language was achingly beautiful. I'd never known spoken words could sound like this. I was overcome by the desire to hear Lanyon sing. What must elvish music sound like? The melodies and lyrics and instruments. Beatrice! Radagast interrupted my thoughts, motioning for me to gather my supplies from his saddlebags. I jumped, realizing that I'd been staring vacantly at Lanyon like a lovesick puppy. Sorry, I muttered, feeling heat creep into my face. You've not seen an elf before, Radagast said as I grabbed my things from Poppy's bags. I winced, knowing that even spacey, bumbling Radagast had seen my awkwardness around Lanyon. There was no way the elf hadn't noticed too. There aren't any elves where I'm from, I stammered. They don't exist back home. I didn't know they'd be so... I gestured helplessly into the air. That they are. Radagast rolled his eyes as he fussily rearranged his supplies in the saddlebags. Are you ready, Miss Smith? Lanyon asked, transferring some of my bulkier items onto his horse. Oh, I exclaimed. Yeah, just a sec. Suddenly feeling reluctant, I turned back to Radagast. So you're leaving? The wizard nodded. You are in safe hands with Lanyon. Now I must return to my home with all haste. Tell Lord Elrond of everything that has transpired since you arrived here. It is imperative that he knows of Sauron's treachery. You may trust him. Okay, I said. I don't know how to thank you for helping me. Radagast looked startled. Oh, there is no need. Yes, there is, I insisted. You saved my life, and I meant it when I said I'd pay you back. I'll find some way to make it up to you. Before I could think about my words, I added, I'll see you again to pay you back before I return to Texas, okay? I promised. My dear, there's no debt, Radagast insisted, looking uncomfortable. His hands twitched as he picked a loose thread on his cloak. Do not trouble yourself. I hugged the wizard tightly, cutting off his stammering. I'll miss you, Radagast the Brown, I said, my voice muffled by his ratty old cloak. Radagast patted my head awkwardly, as though I were one of the rabbits he'd spoken to in the wilderness, and hastily freed myself. I gave a sniffling laugh. Away with you now, he shooed me in Lanyon's direction. Hurry off. Bye then, I managed. Oh, and tell Poppy goodbye too. I was so preoccupied with my farewells that I forgot to be embarrassed when Lanyon took my hand and helped me onto the back of his horse. Before I knew it, the elf and I were cantering away. I twisted in the saddle to see Radagast mounting his horse. He looked oddly somber as we rode away, a solitary figure swallowed up by a windswept brown cloak. Radagast is quite the character, isn't he? The elf said after a while. I nodded hesitantly, my shyness returning in full force as I awkwardly adjusted my grip on Lanyon's torso. My face was burning. I hadn't showered in goodness knew how many days. I was sweaty and dirty and bruised, and I was pretty sure there were pieces of grass in my hair, and now I was awkwardly pressed up against the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. This had to be a nightmare. It had to be. Just kill me now, honestly. What I am most curious about, however, the elf added, is the mortal woman who convinced him to travel with her. Convinced? I mumbled. I didn't convince him to do anything. He offered to take me to Rivendell. Of course, Lanyon said, though he sounded skeptical. Yet all the same, I've never known Radagast the Brown to take on such a traveling companion. We rode in silence, an uncomfortable silence, at least on my part. I greatly preferred traveling with Radagast, even with his strange quirks and mannerisms. I felt starstruck around Lanyon. He was just so unnatural. Even his horse was just a little too graceful, a little too silent, and it seemed to respond to the elf's wishes even more innately than Poppy had to Radagast's commands. Relief washed over me when we finally came to a rugged little path that wound down the side of a hill, descending into a wooded valley. Welcome to Rivendell, Lanyon said, turning in the saddle to smile back at me. My breath hitched. Seeing the elf's smile was like staring into the sun. This is a little bit on the nose, don't you think?
Yeah, it is.
But then I looked ahead and I wasn't sure my lungs would ever work properly again. Rivendell was beautiful, achingly beautiful. Like the elves themselves, the movie didn't do it justice in the slightest. Lanyon's horse carried us down into the broad valley, and I felt myself overwhelmed with what I could only describe as magic. The air itself smelled sweet and clean and renewing, and the sunlight beamed down across the treetops below us in a brighter shade of gold than I'd ever seen. Judging by the faraway sound of rushing water, a river was flowing through the valley too, mingling with birdsong and the wind in the grass, and just on the edge of hearing, the sound of voices. They were elves' voices, they had to be, and they were singing. I leaned desperately over Lanyon's shoulder, all embarrassment forgotten as I strained to hear more, but nothing sounded familiar. The instruments, they were far away still, but I didn't think they sounded like violins. At least not like violins I was used to. Harps I recognized, and voices singing in the same ethereal language Lanyon and Radagast had spoken in earlier today. One of the voices burst into laughter, and my heart skipped a beat. This was too much. I didn't have enough eyes and ears to take it all in. Miss Smith. I jumped. What? Lanyon didn't turn around, but I could tell he was rolling his eyes. I said, Miss, that you must wish for a bath, and perhaps a meal before being granted an audience with Lord Elrond. Am I not mistaken? Oh, right, I stammered. I mean, I don't want to impose, I added uncomfortably. I'd forgotten all about Elrond. I hadn't even realized that Lanyon's horse had already led us across a beautiful stone bridge at the bottom of the valley, and we were now in some kind of beautiful courtyard filled with gardens, fountains, and delicate archways. Come now, it will not take long. A maidservant will gladly see to a bath and a hot meal for you. Lanyon turned and helped me dismount. Despite his grace, I still managed to catch my sandal in the stirrups and nearly elbowed him in the face as I stumbled down from his horse. He gracefully chose not to comment on this new embarrassment. Well, Miss Smith? I looked around, face burning, still in shock at where I was. Honestly, a bath sounded more amazing than anything else in the world, and I hadn't had a hot meal in ages. I couldn't even imagine how comfortable the rooms here would be, and how nice it might be to sleep on something other than a stolen sleeping bag or a filthy straw bed in a prison cell in Isengard. Isengard. No, I need to speak to Elrond, I said frantically, images coming to my mind unbidden of Gandalf trapped on the roof of Orthanc, of Saruman's collection of weaponry, the fiery shape of that eye, and his crystal ball thing. I can't wait, it just can't. Please, you have to take me to him now. Are you certain, miss? Lanyon raised an eyebrow at me. Yes, I nearly screamed, pulling helplessly at the roots of my tangled hair. I know I'm gross and whatnot, I don't give a crap. When can I see Elrond? Right now, as a matter of fact, a voice said from behind me. I froze, feeling the blood rush to my face. Of course this would happen. Lord Elrond, Lanyon exclaimed. He bowed slightly to the elf approaching us, who nodded his head in return. I wondered if I should bow too, or curtsy or something, but the moment seemed to have passed as I stood there awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot. Lanyon launched into rapid-fire Elvish, perhaps hoping to prevent me from speaking and embarrassing myself further. I caught the name Radagast several times, but nothing else. That will do, Lanyon, Elrond said after a moment, nodding sagely. Tend to your horse and to our guests' belongings. I need you patrolling our eastern borders again before nightfall. Of course, my lord, Lanyon bowed again and turned to me. Well met then, Miss Smith. I hope to learn more of your story upon our next meeting. He gave me another dazzling smile. Unable to find my voice, I gave him a pathetic little wave as he led his horse away. Now, Elrond said, I understand that you need to speak with me. Yes, sir, I stammered. I mean, if that's all right. I didn't mean to... Elrond raised an eyebrow slightly, but I couldn't tell if he was annoyed or amused. My dear, I distinctly heard you say that you do not give a... Well, it matters not. Come with me to my library, and we will speak. I nodded, my face burning, and allowed myself to be led through the courtyard by the Lord of Rivendell. And that's chapter 10. So, I guess I'll present my thoughts. Her description is kind of lacking. I think... Oh, really? Going ahead, you're saying, like, yeah. Rivendell was beautiful. Like, you know, beautiful is kind of subjective, right? It could look different for anyone. So you kind of have to, like, describe... Like, she maybe had a little bit of, like, the golden light coming through the trees. That was good. Because you can actually visualize that, right? Mm-hmm. Also... I don't know. I feel like it's just... This chapter was a lot about description and stuff. Yeah. And, like, describing setting. And, you know, she doesn't do that great of a job with that. Again, there's a whole, like, you know, describing things from this one person's feelings and just, like, giving so, like a word vomit of feelings. Like, I was feeling this, and this made me feel so this. And, oh, this elf was so unworldly. Like, unworldly could mean, like, the girl from The Ring, you know? Like, it doesn't have to mean, like, beautiful. So she really doesn't understand, like, the whole, you know, describe the setting in things that aren't metaphysical.
Yeah. Anyway. Well, here's the thing. I feel like she goes, like, not in the same way that the last fanfiction writer did, where she just like described like literally every outfit, literally every look,
That was
every
interesting.
yeah, it was definitely
Yeah,
interesting.
it's actually
yeah.
the polar opposite. You're right. Yeah.
I don't feel like she's not that far, but I still feel like she does add a lot of like description to her stuff, and I've noticed you kind of tripping up the same way I have, because it's just like it's so
There's a
much
lot of lees
there.
and long
Yes.
words, like large
Mhm.
words that you probably
Yes.
don't need.
Exactly, and it's also like I feel like she wrote this but didn't actually like read it out to herself. Like some of the things just don't flow. I feel like they should. I don't know if you picked up on that, but it's a little like choppy.
It's less.
It's still better.
It's
way
less
better
mechanical than the last two stories we've read. But it's still like I don't know. It's kind of mechanical. Like things happen and they make sense. But it just, the way she describes it doesn't make it feel magical. It just feels like another YA fiction kind of deal.
I agree. There's nothing really that sets this apart from any other, as you said, YA fiction property that's out there. Like I don't
But
really
I think maybe
see
that's
any
a compliment because this is fan fiction and not YA fiction.
But I don't really see any of the Lord of the Rings lore. Maybe also because I'm not a fan.
Yeah,
and
no,
I
you
don't know
this
anything.
it's quite like it fits. Like she did a lot of work
Okay.
into making this like plot line parallel and also like reasonable. Besides the whole helicopter incident, that was ridiculous.
Yeah, that was ridiculous.
I was really like on that last. I thought she was gonna just drive away.
Uh-huh.
Like I straight up just thought she was gonna get in a car and drive because that would make sense and that would actually be more like less noticeable. And you could still have the fuel thing where the car, like the engine starts malfunctioning, and the whole story could have been the same, except it would have been a lot more believable and a lot more like immersive, but it's not.
Okay, so one last question, but I want to ask before we move on. Who is Boromir? Because I see above it says like a slow burn. Excuse me. Between Boromir and OC. Is Boromir
Boromir's
Elrond?
coming soon because there's a scene where they go in the first book where they meet the Fellowship at Rivendell, and so I'm thinking Beatrice is gonna find, she's gonna meet Boromir at this, at Rivendell, right?
Okay.
Also looks like she has this massive crush on Lanyon.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is there like some type of love triangle thing going on?
I sure hope not. I sure hope not, because that's the trope of fan fiction, is that everything is romance, and all the all the
not
intrigue.
Just romance. Not just romance. Sorry to cut you off. Yeah, I understand it's cheap. Not just romance though, Aaron, but a love triangle. Like that is such a generic trope. I feel like just because I've seen it so many times in media.
No, it's because every
tiring.
fan fiction like thrives off of the love triangle or the love circle or the love octagon or whatever love shape you want to draw.
Right.
It's kind of boring. I was kind of thinking this would be like it wouldn't involve romance. I think this would be a great story if she would write it without romance, because it just feels cheesy the way she describes it.
Especially a female-led story. I would love to see just a female that is just a girl. That's just a woman. A woman that's just like confident and strong, and she doesn't have to like resort to like a romance. Because like let's be honest, like a lot of male-centric stories don't really involve romance. Sometimes, but
yeah, they
it's
do.
usually about the
Are you kidding me? Harry Potter?
Okay, but
was all
but that's not really. It's not really a main focal point. Like you don't think Harry Potter, you don't think romance, right?
A lot of the best male-centered stories that don't involve like male-female romance centers on male to male love, but not romantic, like a friendship kind of thing. It's just
platonic.
Like like Sam and Frodo, right? Since we're on Lord of the Rings, right. Sam and Frodo, I'm sure you've at least seen a bit of the movies.
Heard of them,
right? And Sam and Frodo, it's like I don't know. Also, Shawshank Redemption was a big, famous example of like a love story about friendship.
Yeah.
Because this
No,
kind
I
of
get
love is
that.
this kind of love is cheap. Like this kind of crushing on an obsession kind of thing is like very immature. I really hope it doesn't go in that direction. We'll have to see. Chapter 11 is your chapter, I believe.
Yes, I believe that this is probably going to be the last one. Just judging based off time restraints. So
Yeah,
we'll try and see where it
We
goes
spent a
from
long
there.
time. Also, these chapters are getting really long.
Oh,
But it's okay. It's okay because this is we're supposed to we sign up for this. Okay, chapter 11. It's yours. Take it
Chapter
away.
11. I'm new in town, and it gets worse. I followed Elrond in a bit of a daze, struggling to keep up with his swift pace while trying to look at everything around me all at once. We walked down a meandering hall lined with white stone, broad windows opening onto tree-lined paths and courtyards. As before, the sounds of rushing water and far-off music echoed faintly all around, and my head spun as I tried to take it all in. I wondered, briefly, if I was dreaming. Here and there, other elves walked by or sat and talked to one another, their laughter bouncing merrily through the gardens and halls. I stared in fascination at them, my jaw opened slightly. I couldn't help it. They were just so inhuman. But when they turned to stare curiously back at me, I looked away nervously, unable to quite meet their eyes. Like Elrond, they were all dressed in flowing robes with high cheekbones, flawless skin, and model-like hair. I winced and fiddled with my own hair in embarrassment as we walked, only to find a piece of grass stuck in the greasy tangles around my shoulders. I ducked my head and willed Elrond to walk faster. Lanyon said that your name was Smith, the elf said kindly, finally opening a tall wooden door at the end of the hall and beckoning me inside. Yes, sir. I'm Beatrice Smith, I replied hesitantly, glancing around curiously as I walked inside. This wasn't at all what I had expected from an elfish library. It was cluttered, cramped, and far less airy than anything I'd seen of Rivendell so far. But I liked it immediately. Leather-bound books were stacked perilously along the walls, and scrolls dotted with thick wax seals overflowed from the drawers of several wooden writing desks. Sunlight streamed in, heavy and gold, through a row of windows lining the low ceiling, and the whole room smelled pleasantly of paper and dust. So then, Beatrice Smith, Elrond repeated, sitting down behind a desk and motioning for me to take a seat opposite to him. That is a rather unusual name. Oh, it's nothing out of the ordinary where I'm from, I assured him, perching awkwardly on the edge of a chair. And where are you from, Miss Smith? I hesitated, fiddling with my tangled hair again. Well, how much did Lanyon tell you? A few details, Elrond replied vaguely. Though I would rather hear your own account of the tale. What, then, was this news that could not wait? I felt myself flush, embarrassed at his mention of my panicked outburst at Lanyon in the courtyard earlier. Right, well, I started, then broke off. You're not going to believe me, I warned him. I believe I can judge for myself the veracity of your words, Miss Smith. Go on. I nodded, took another breath, and began to tell him everything. Talking to Elrond was a lot more difficult than talking to Radagast. As I stammered out my story, I found myself barely able to even look Elrond in the eyes. His stern gaze was unsettling. It was so oddly inhuman, young and old at once, both attractive and intimidating. I didn't remember the actor in the movie being this hot. Why does he have to be hot? It's Lanyon all over again.
Hey, that's
Damn it.
mean. I think the actor is hot. I think the actor who acts Elrond looks good. You don't have to do him like that, bro. Anyway, keep going.
Like Radagast, Elrond let me tell my story uninterrupted. His face, however, was far more expressive than the spacey wizard's had been, and his eyebrows arched higher and higher towards his hairline each time I dared a glance at him. Incredulity clear on his face. Whatever he had been expecting to hear, it apparently hadn't involved other worlds and helicopters. I couldn't exactly blame him. Finally, I finished explaining my meeting with Radagast and running into Lanyon. And now I don't know what to do, I finished in a rush. Because Gandalf is probably still trapped in Isengard, and I have no idea how to get home. And Saruman is probably reading about the future of Middle-earth right now, and if he figures out how to use all the weapons he's stolen, then Yes, I believe you. I believe I understand you, Elrond said, holding up a hand to stop my rambling. He studied me for a long moment with a new expression, the fatherly sort of kindness replaced by something chilly. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, dropping my gaze to the ground. I couldn't help but wonder, as I had done with Gandalf, how I must appear to someone like Elrond, probably like a homeless person or a basket case, considering the state of my clothes and hair and the bruises and dirt on my face, not to mention my wild, rambling words. It was quite the story, Miss Smith, the elf said at last. I winced. I'm sorry. You were correct that I would have difficulty believing your tale, he continued. His voice was mild, but his words were cold and seemed to hold a warning. Saruman the White has been an ally of Imladris, yeah, for ages uncounted. To suggest that he has betrayed us, betrayed one of his own order, is a serious accusation indeed. I know it is, I said urgently, but it's true, I promise. Please, if you don't believe me, something terrible might happen to Gandalf, and Saruman might... Calm yourself, miss, Elrond said, mildly, holding up a hand again. I shook my head desperately. You have to believe me, I exclaimed. I don't know if Gandalf believed me when I tried to ward him, but Radagast did. He can tell you if you reach out to him again. Your second claim is even more absurd, Elrond spoke over me evenly. You say that Saruman has been gathering weapons from your homeland over the course of many years through his possession of one of the Palantiri. I nodded emphatically, though the elf continued before I could speak. How many of these weapons has he gathered, and what exactly is their nature? He asked. How many soldiers could be armed with these tools, and is it likely that he might create more weapons of a similar capacity in Isengard's forges? Does this mean you believe me? Answer the questions, if you please, Miss Smith. Unsettled by the icy calm in his voice, I launched into a hasty description of everything I knew about Saruman's guns, grenades, pipe bombs, and drones. Thinking back to every weapon and machine stockpiled in those horrible storerooms, I tried to force down the discomfort that came with the memories of that place, but it didn't work. My stomach twisted and my blood felt cold. Please believe me, please, I thought feverishly, biting the inside of my cheek as I spoke to Elrond, who had methodically unfurled a blank scroll of parchment and began to make notes of my descriptions. A moment of unbearable silence followed my words, in which Elrond's quill continued to scratch elegantly against the parchment. I craned my neck slightly to peer at his words, but they were in a strange flowing alphabet I didn't recognize. Your third claim, Elrond said, finally, settling down his quill with a small flourish. It's the most outlandish of all. You say that all of our history, the entire Middle-earth, is written down in books in your homeland? Who then was the author of these texts, that he came to know of our world? An elf? A wizard? His name was Tolkien, I said hesitantly. He was a professor, I think. He wasn't a wizard or anything. He was human. The stories he wrote were fiction, I explained. Made up, for entertainment. Everybody where I'm from thinks Middle-earth doesn't exist, and the story with Gandalf and the hobbits and the ring is just fantasy. The ring? Elrond repeated sharply. I clapped a hand over my mouth. You have read this story, he said, his tone unreadable, and I winced, looking back down at my knees. You have read the future of Middle-earth. It is written in a book from another land, penned by a professor, for entertainment. His voice was flat, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was saying and was hoping I would correct him. I've read a bit of the story, I admitted, deciding to leave the concept of movies for another day. As far as Elrond needed to know, seeing a bit of the movie was the same as reading a bit of the book. I don't really remember much, though, honest, and I never got to the end. Believe me, if I'd known it was real, I'd have paid more attention, I said, giving a humorless smile that Elrond did not return. Indeed, he said slowly. He was still studying me as though trying to put together the pieces of a particularly troublesome puzzle. Did you mention the ring to Saruman? No, of course not, I exclaimed. I'm not stupid. Elrond sighed and nodded, and then sat back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and rested his forehead against his hands. A long moment passed. The comforting, cozy nature of the room had become stifling, and I fidgeted in my seat. Finally, Elrond met my eyes again. I believe you, Miss Smith. I jumped up in my chair. You do? You will forgive my harshness, I hope. You have been honest with me from the beginning, yet I confess I did not wish to believe your words. It's okay, I told him, smiling hesitantly. I didn't want to believe any of it either. Elrond's eyes turned to one of the low windows, where a sliver of dusty blue sky was visible between the trees. He sighed again. This news bodes ill for many, miss. Our list of allies has grown thin. Yes, your story is outlandish, but it seems that I must trust you. After all, your story is corroborated by Lanyon's words, which themselves come from Radagast the Brown. Eccentric the wizard may be, but I would be a fool to ignore Radagast's wisdom, or to have reservations about those in whom he has placed his trust. The friendship of an Istari is not earned without reason. Would that we could trust all wizards thus, he added darkly. And to think that all of this occurred under the very noses of the White Council. I didn't know what the White Council was or what Astari meant, but I nodded. So then, I said hesitantly, what are we going to do? We? Elrond repeated, looking surprised. Yes, I exclaimed. How are we going to save Gandalf and stop Saruman from reading that book and using his weapons? We need to do something now. The more time we spend sitting here, the likelier it is that Saruman will have... We are not going to do anything, Miss Smith, Elrond said, raising a hand for silence once again. Forgive me, but I cannot see that you will be able to help any further. You mean there's nothing I can do? But it's my fault that Saruman has that book. And my fault that I couldn't warn Gandalf in time. My fault that I left him in Isengard. There must be some way I can help. I have to try. I can't just sit here and do nothing. What, then, do you propose to do? Elrond asked pointedly. I deflated at his tone, my fervor dwindling as quickly as it had come. I don't know, I stammered. I felt stupid. What could I do, after all? Run back to Isengard and get captured once again? I was just a violinist. I wasn't even supposed to be here, anyway. None of this was supposed to be happening. Is there anything that can be done? I asked helplessly, feeling overwhelmed. Rest assured, miss, Elrond said. What help I can offer to Gandalf will be given, though I fear that it will likely not be enough. I will speak to those who remain loyal to Imladris, increase the security around our borders, and gather our forces as best as I can. But we are not equipped to go to war, and if what you say about the weapons in Saruman's possession is true, Imladris is not likely to outlast an attack from Isengard. Imladris? That is its official name. You would call it Rivendell in the Westron tongue. Westron? Elrond closed his eyes as though fighting back a heavy sigh. The language we are speaking now, miss. Right! Sorry, I felt myself flush. I was more out of my element than I thought. The elf seemed to be thinking along the same lines. Beatrice Smith, you have done very well to bring all of this news to me, and at great peril to yourself, judging by your tale. For a young woman with so little understanding of Middle-earth, you have done unthinkably well. I dare say many a seasoned warrior would not have had such success. But you know very little of Middle-earth. You are no warrior, nor spy, nor diplomat. I will likely call upon you again to learn more about the technology Saruman has summoned to Isengard from your world, but I cannot see that you will be able to help any further in stopping him. My heart sank at his words. He was right. I knew. But that didn't change the magnitude of the problems I had caused, or the helplessness I felt. However, there is one thing I would ask of you, Miss Smith, he added. Really? What? I perked up again. I must insist that you keep whatever knowledge you possess of these books a secret. Do not tell anyone, not even me, what you have read, or even what you guess, about the future of our world. I fear that such knowledge would serve only to lead us astray, despite our best intentions. Oh, my heart sank again. Of course, I understand. Now, Miss Smith, I suggest you rest. You have had a difficult journey here, and are more than welcome to stay in our guest quarters. Lanyons will have seen to your belongings. Elrond stood up, indicating our conversation was over. Wait, sir, I hesitated. The question had been burning in the back of my mind ever since I had arrived in Rivendell. And now then that the time had come to ask it, I could barely get the words out of fear of what Elrond would say. Is there anything you can do to help me get back home? Elrond raised his eyebrows. Please, I said. Gandalf said he didn't think he could help me, but I was just hoping maybe you might be able to do something, or maybe you know of something I could do. somewhere I could go to figure out how to get back? The elf signed, and I knew what he was going to say before he even said it. I'm afraid I cannot do what you ask, Miss Smith. I possess no such magical abilities, and if Gandalf cannot help you, I know of no others who might be able to do so. Tears stung behind my eyes. I already know what you're thinking. It had been quite a stretch. I know that. I didn't know why I'd gotten my hopes up at all. It was just the magic of this place, the secret haven of elves. It had been easy to think that anything might be possible here. Miss Smith, Elrond said gently, clearly troubled by my silence. It's okay, I mumbled, though hardly any sound came out. I understand. I broke off and looked away, not trusting myself to speak around the lump in my throat. I didn't want to cry in front of Elrond. I just couldn't. I had already cried in front of nearly everyone else I'd met in Middle Earth. I was pathetic.
Yeah,
This thought...
That's crazy.
This thought made me even more miserable, and I covered my eyes with a shaking hand. I'm sorry, I managed, taking a deep breath and steadying myself. I'm sorry. My voice broke. Why do you apologize? The elf lord asked, shaking his head. You have no reason to be sorry. He approached and rested a hand on my shoulder comfortingly, though his face was still stern. Nor do you have reason to lose hope. If I am to glean anything from your tale, it is that nothing in Middle-earth is certain. The world is changing, and the guidelines that govern us seem to no longer be set in stone. You see, Miss Smith, he sighed, and strode to one of the low windows. His eyes were far away. I can no longer say what is possible or what is not. You may find a way home. I nodded, taking a deep breath and swallowing bitterly. Thank you, sir. Well, Miss Smith, I believe we have spoken enough for the present. You are exhausted, and I shall not interrogate you further until you have rested and eaten. At his words, my shoulders slumped, as though my body hadn't realized how tired I was until he had pointed out. That sounds wonderful, I admitted. Elrond opened the heavy wooden door of his library, gesturing politely for me to walk through. Lanyon will have alerted the maidservants of your arrival, he said. I imagine a room will have been readied for you by now in the northwest wing. I will show you the way, quickly, if you do not mind, and that I have a great deal to accomplish. Thank you, I said earnestly, following Elrond down the hall. My whole body ached with weariness, and I followed the elf rather woodenly, hardly taking in my surroundings anymore. Here you are, Miss Smith, Elrond said, gesturing elegantly down a hall slightly narrower than the rest. One of the doors at the end of the hall stood open, and it was there that the elf was pointing. Do not hesitate to alert one of the maidservants if you require anything else, he said kindly, and placed his hand on my shoulder. As I said before, I'm afraid I will likely call on you within the next few days to ask you further questions about your journey here. Okay, I said reluctantly. If there's anything else I can do to help, of course, Miss Smith. With that, the elf swept away briskly, his footsteps silent in the empty hall. I sighed, suddenly exhausted beyond words, and made my way to the open door at the end of the hall. I hadn't been sure what to expect, but it wasn't this. A low, canopied bed occupied the center of a large but cozy room, pale blue drapes hanging delicately above the bed's frame. The ceiling was low and made up of gently arching slats of gray wood, which were adorned with faint carvings of leaves and blossoms. Blue-gray curtains framed a little window, out of which tree branches swayed lazily in the wind. An empty metal washtub sat in the corner, next to a pile of folded white blankets. It was all so beautiful and calming and homey. I wouldn't have believed it was for me if my dirt-covered bags and violin case weren't stacked under the window. I sat down on the corner of the mattress, intending to unpack my things, but instead, I fell back onto the bed with a deep sigh, and I was asleep before my head hit the pillows. And that was chapter 11. First, let me take a water break real quick. Okay, I'm back. Honestly, I think that, this chapter was good. I think I like this chapter probably of the ones I've personally read. I think that it didn't really show maybe any advancement in the plot, but at least something is kind of happening with the information flow that's kind of going on. And so yeah, I'm I liked most of everything that was kind of discussed here. I like Elrond as a character. I think that he works for his purpose. I kind of see the way that the writer may be writing him. So, yeah, I'm intrigued to see where his story goes and see if it follows my understanding of where I think it will go, at least. But yeah, Aaron, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm so glad they didn't just like, or B didn't just start making out with like Elrond in his library, because I was really afraid that something really dumb and like silly about how hot the elves were was gonna happen. So I'm glad that didn't happen. Elrond is Elrond. It's pretty accurate, which is good. To the book, to his character in the book. It's very clear that she took a lot of time researching Rivendell's interior. She knows a lot about the series she's writing about.
Yeah, I was gonna say that as well.
Again, these chapters kind of read like filler chapters for a fourth Lord of the Rings book. So they like nothing really big happens in them. But it kind of just like a little bit of information. So now you know that Elrond believes, Elrond knows basically. That's the entirety of this chapter. It's just now Elrond knows, which is a single sentence. So I think I should maybe applaud myself for summarizing like a few hundred or few thousand words into like three. But yeah, I mean, these chapters are just getting kind of tedious.
They are. I
accompanied
think
by the lack of like plot development, and it's just like information.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. It's a podcast.
I definitely have noticed that it's a lot of it's saying a lot, but not really meaning much, and I feel like it's kind of, I don't want to say it's unnecessary, because I think that in stories you do need
it's
to.
Absolutely
I'm sorry.
Necessary.
Well, okay, I think that you need to flesh out your story, but I feel like a lot of this could just be done in like one part. Like the chapter that I read, chapter 9, I do feel like that chapter could have been condensed like heavily, and I don't think I mentioned it at the time, but I think it didn't need to be that long. And same with this. I mean, this one was a lot shorter than the last two we read. But it still felt like they were just saying a lot without really meaning much. And as you said, really the only new piece of information is Elrond knowing about the books existing and like the whole, basically the plot that's happened up until now. So, I don't know. I just feel like it's kind of, I'm waiting for the story to get good. I feel like we're still...
Yeah.
Would you say we're still in the rising action?
Yeah, we're
like,
we're still very early on in what would be considered the rising action.
Yeah,
so a lot of things still need to happen. Like she needs to actually be on the way. Like she actually has to know. If this was structured like a novella, at this point she would know how to like save her, like how to return to her world. She would just be looking for the resources or looking for someone. She would be in that point of the story, not like, hey, I just escaped like a few days ago. Like I have no idea what's going on and I'm breaking down into tears every. Like she would have the sense of determination by now, and her character would be evolved to the point that she would be, instead of reacting, she would be, enacting change.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we're almost halfway through this entire story. I'm hoping that it starts picking up, and I feel like she's slowly gaining that confidence, but it's still not.
See, but I'm not getting that. Is the thing. I feel like she's still kind of pathetic. Just kind of like useless. She does her thing, or she cries, and someone's like, "Don't worry about it, you'll be fine." And she's like, "Oh, great, it'll be fine." And then something minor goes wrong, and she's like, "Oh God, my life!" Like, come on, you need
I
that
see what
sense
you mean.
Of, like, at a certain point, you gotta have like, I would have put it during the trek with like Radagast. I would have her like evolve and be like learning things. Like this is how you survive in the wild. And like maybe Radagast, I guess he is a forager. So like, yeah, this is how you like find plants, and this is how you know where water is, and this is how like so that she actually is able to do something.
Well, yeah, I would have had Radagast teaching her that. Like,
Yeah, and
I
this
think
is
it would be a little
again,
bit
you've
kind
mentioned
of
this is
silly.
No, you go.
No, I was just gonna say, I think it would be. I hear what you're saying completely, but I feel like it would be a little bit silly for her to just like automatically know all this knowledge, especially if we're not given any reason to believe that she has like outdoor survivor knowledge. That was another thing where like that whole like section where she was talking about like how she doesn't camp or whatever. Like I feel like that was just like to show. What is it? Like telling, not showing.
Show don't
us.
tell. Yeah, show don't tell.
Yeah.
Exactly. A lot of this story is just like, okay, so you can tell a lot about the age of the writer from how she writes. So when you're younger, you kind of tend to like when you think about a story, right? You think about a plot, you think about a story, you start to think about where are we, you know, like how does my imagination paint this canvas and not what actually is happening. So like again, we've mentioned that the plot is very slow and like it's constantly overburdened with like pointless descriptions of things. So I think it's very like the author's writing sense is kind of like at that stage where it's like writing is all about showing, like detailing the setting and like showing this world, building this world, when she doesn't realize that what's really necessary is like a driving force behind everything that she writes. Like there's when she's talking to Elrond, right? Like the entire thing could just be put into a single paragraph. Be like she was telling Elrond, and Elrond asked them a few questions, and she answered it like this and this, and then he was like, after a while, he believed her, like something like that, right?
Yeah, that's
we
what
need
I'm
to move
talking
this
about, like the
action along, because
condensation.
otherwise there's nothing happening in the story, and it is literal just filler.
Yeah, it does feel like a lot of filler because like it just feels like I said, I feel like I'm just reading things, and while it's engaging, I think the writing is engaging partly because like the past fanfics that we read have not been super
Yeah, if the only
easy to
reason
read
this
and then
fanfic is good is
interesting.
because we've read My Immortal right beforehand, it doesn't make this
Right.
fanfic like good per se, like good writing. It just means it's like okay, it's readable.
Yeah, I agree. But I don't know. I feel like the story still has potential. I think that there are some things
I'm really waiting for it to pick up.
There is some things I'm kind of looking forward to. I'm looking forward to how the eventual fight. I know there's going to be a fight.
Oh, of course.
Between,
Come on. It can't be Lord of the Rings fanfic without a sword fight.
Between I imagine like B and Saruman, I guess. And so I'm excited for that. I'm excited to see how she eventually finds her way back, because I feel like at this point she's kind of stuck there. I do want to say real quickly that I feel like her whole like character up until this point, I can't say I necessarily like blame her, because like she had a really good life, I think, you know, back in
She didn't
like,
though. She
real
had
life.
like a tough life because she was a musician. She was struggling to survive. You know, she had this very like old, described like a ratty old apartment, right? And like, so
But
she didn't have a
still-
life, so she doesn't like. I feel like she'd be more adaptable, especially because she spent her entire younger life like, you know,
Moving
living in the
around.
woods and camping and stuff, right? You would
Yeah.
think that she'd be more adaptable. Than whatever this crap is, unless it's about aerospace. She seems to be a genius aerospace engineer, because even I can't learn how to freaking fly a helicopter in 10 minutes.
I do feel like but I think that the thing that, you know, I'm kind of getting with her character is that like I think
It's
that she's
inconsistent.
made to be this basic and like this like emotional almost, because it'd be like how the average reader would feel in this type of scenario. And so I think that's the reason why she's not like super, like, for lack of a
Okay, but
better
it
word,
only
like
makes
badass.
sense. It only makes sense if the average reader is like 10 years old. Like,
Yeah,
well, okay.
but it does kind of read. No, but like it does kind of read like more of a. I don't want to say like fanfiction in general is for kids, but it does read more like a tweeny type like book, like 12 to 14 maybe.
Of course.
Like, it's
of course.
not-
There's no other reason for her mentioning every single time this girl starts crying. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Because she's just using crying, like the main character crying, to kind of just like indicate that she's feeling some sort of emotion. Like, I'm feeling sad, so I'm gonna burst into tears. You can feel sad and like you can describe how she like changed her dialogue, you know, like shorter sentences, kind of more curt
attitude toward things would, you know, indicate sadness or like distraction. Again, she, you know, doesn't seem to, I don't know, really understand, I guess.
Yeah, but
Anyway.
we'll see what happens in
Yeah,
the
we
in the
will
next
see.
chapter.
We will see. Do you want to do an outro, or do you want me to do the outro?
I can do the outro.
All right.
So that was chapters 9 through 11 of Burn Like Cold Iron. We will be back next time to hopefully cover the next set of chapters. I'm leaving it vague because I'm not sure how many chapters we'll be covering, but I'm sure that will be in the video description. So yeah, see you guys next time.
Oh, it's very much not going to be in the video description, but yeah, it will be an unnamed number of chapters. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.